Okay, so my name is Abram Brummett. I'm a professor of bioethics at a little medical school in Southeast Michigan. And already? No, just kidding. Careful with those. And also I work as a clinical ethicist at our flagship hospital in Southeast Michigan, Corwell Royal Oak. I guess it's a little hard for me to gauge kind of the background of the audience on bioethics. I've never been to this conference before. But I'll just tell you a little bit about my talk today. The purpose of this talk is really in the context of a book project that I'm doing with my co-author, Matt Shea, and another co-author, Jason Eberl, who isn't here today. And the key question at the heart of our book project is a question that has bedeviled bioethics since its inception. And it's called the question of ethics expertise. And the question basically goes like this: is secular bioethics, is it just a neutral space where people with many different, particular worldviews can come together and discuss the questions of bioethics? When I talk about the questions of bioethics, I'm talking about what I would call foundational clinical research and public health questions. Questions like, a foundational question would be like, should we clone humans? Okay, and if we decide, right out the gate that we don't want to have anything to do with that, then we wouldn't really have the other questions about how to research it, how to deliver it in the clinic, how to deliver it at a public health level. But if we did decide that it was, something ethically permissible to do, then the other kinds of questions would arise. And we have tons of an overwhelming number of questions like this in the world of bioethics. And so the primary question of the book is to say, when we're doing secular bioethics, are we just getting a bunch of different worldviews together to discuss these questions, and just sort of facilitating that conversation? Or is bioethics this thing that's actually able to give some moral guidance on these questions? As tricky and difficult as a thing like that to do would be, especially in a society like ours that's highly pluralistic. It's a very strange time to do the kind of work that I do, especially in the hospital, as a clinical ethicist. So that's the primary question. Which of these two ways should we understand, our discipline of bioethics? And then, again, these are the domains of bioethics. Matt and I, all three of us have background in these academic bioethics questions, or what I called sort of foundational bioethics. We think bioethics should debate things like the ethical permissibility of abortion, euthanasia, gender-affirming care, all of this kind of stuff. But a lot of our remarks today will come at this thesis that we want to make. The thesis is that bioethics should give moral guidance in a pluralistic society. The way we're going to approach this frequently will be through the clinical context. So I'll give a lot of examples of the kind of work that I do in the clinic and kinds of things that I often say when stakeholders consult me in the hospital that are morally substantive and that I think we ought to be saying. But there's a lot of people who really disagree with me about that. One of the biggest, so let me just say a little bit more just to maybe clarify the question even further. What is the debate about when we talk about this debate about ethics expertise? You might think, well, if you can't give moral guidance, what do these people even think clinical ethicists are doing in the hospital? It's a good question. So I distinguish between the expertise of ethicists, and the expertise of ethicists includes things like this. providing quasi-legal advice. So you might say something like, well, in the state of Michigan, a valid advance directive requires 2 witness signatures, whatever. Engage in dispute mediation, right? So we have a lot of training. I've sat in a lot of rooms with families and doctors and tried to help, talk to each other. The language of medicine and the language that the rest of us use are very different things, and I try to help translate communication. That's important. You could do that without giving moral guidance, maybe. And more like descriptive academic analysis. So I might say, like in my note, oh, here's, doctors, you're using this notion of futility when you want to, not do another round of dialysis for this patient. Well, here's 3 different notions of futility in the literature, and here's how they're defined. I would parse concepts, or maybe I would identify logical fallacies. I think that's something that you could do that wouldn't be too contentious. Or I might lay out, descriptive moral geography. I might say, oh, doctor, we're thinking about deceiving this patient. Well, a Kantian a deontologist might say something more like this about deception. I happen to be really pro-deception. That's another talk. I'll actually tell you a little bit about that. I recommended deception this week, actually. But maybe I'll come back for that. That'll be fun.
Maybe not.
What's that? I'll keep going. I keep going here. I've already talked for 7 minutes. This is crazy. But the ethics expertise question is like, do you go that extra step as an ethicist in the hospital and say, this is what would be morally permissible. This is what would be morally prohibited. This is what would be morally obligatory. Yeah, that's the debate. So what the structure of our book, we basically have 3 parts. So we basically see, we want to give a positive account of ethics expertise for bioethics. So we do think that we should be giving moral guidance in clinical research, public health, and foundational contexts for bioethics. We think bioethics actually started as more of this neutral space, but it has evolved into something that we are now arguing is an emerging tradition in its own right, with substantive moral, metaphysical, and epistemological commitments that Matt will talk about more here in a moment. So we want to articulate that positive account, but we want to defend it from 2 major threats. The first is the postmodern threat, and the second is the increasing threat of moral polarization that we're, currently, I'd say is probably the bigger threat. So that's the trick. I mean, that's what makes this so challenging in our society. How can we give moral guidance, especially in light of these 2 really powerful forces, I guess, in our society? So I'm going to talk about why we're going to reject the postmodern view. Matt's going to talk about our positive project, and our colleague Jason Eberl, he's not here, so you're not going to hear anything about the polarization stuff, which might be the one you really want to talk about. We can talk about it in the Q&A, but you won't hear it in the talk. We're actively writing these chapters now, so we really appreciate, the opportunity to come and kind of throw some of these ideas out and get feedback from you all, so that we can put forward the best account of this that we possibly can. So we really appreciate all of you being here today and listening to this. So here's the guy who is the main champion of what I would call the postmodern critique of secular bioethics, Tris Engelhardt. And this is the seminal text that he wrote of basically his critical appraisal of secular bioethics. Now I'm going to have to start going kind of quickly. So he says, providing ethical guidance, if bioethics is going to do this, it would require us establishing a canonical morality. Okay, so when Engelhardt talks about a canonical morality, what happened there? He's saying something about, we're back. He has a kind of like enlightenment project in mind when he's talking about canonical morality. universally applicable to all people, known with certainty on Englehart's, interpretation. And he says we would have to have that to give moral guidance, but we don't have that. Why don't we have that? Well, he says this cannot be done. We cannot get this canonical morality with discursive reason in morally pluralistic societies comprised of strangers, moral strangers, those who do not share basic moral premises and rules of evidence, without circularity, infinite regression, or begging the question. We've all had this experience of having an argument, a debate, a discussion with someone that we have fundamental disagreements on, with respect to abortion, for example, right? And we've all had this experience of, it's like it gets to a point in the discussion where you're just kind of going in these circles. You realize you're proceeding from just some fundamental premises that seem completely irreconcilable, perhaps. And it just, discursive reason just can't resolve the issue. So for Englehart, it's not just that the people, that maybe one is right, but like they can't convince the other. It's like, no, like reason itself actually can't do probably what either of the people in the discussion thought it could do, which is tell us about the morality of abortion. So, a lot of examples in bioethics are these kinds of things. These are the sorts of things that we focus on in part 3 of the book when we're talking about polarization. These are the things that draw a moral fault line in bioethics between the deepest divide, is what we call it. Let's just call it liberals and conservatives for shorthand. Some bioethicists fall on one side, some fall on the other. And Englehart would say that discursive reason has no way of actually answering any of these questions, again, without falling to his trilemma, which is really just a recapitulation of moral skepticism that goes back to like the ancient Greeks, right? And he acknowledges, he knows this. But this is what I really like about Englehart. He's not just talking about these especially contentious issues in bioethics. He really means like all moral content. Like there is no moral content that we can discursively justify in a secular society. He's really radical. It's one of the things that, one of the reasons why I find his work so interesting. Now this is really important, especially for my context in the hospital, because I find that when I'm doing consultations in the hospital, I'm often saying lots of things that are morally contentful. Now, I might not be telling people things about the morality of, abortion or euthanasia or human enhancement. I don't know that I've ever had a conversation about any of those things in my years in the hospital, but maybe a little bit. But the sorts of things that I say when I give moral guidance in the clinic is drawn from, these kinds of texts in our emerging tradition. The 22 core references used to generate the exam questions for the national license that we now have in clinical ethics consultation. So what are some examples of some things from these 22 core references that are morally contentful? This is one of the things that just drives me nuts about a lot of clinical ethicists. They say, oh no, we're not doing moral guidance, this is just proceduralistic, we're just helping people talk to each other when they have moral conflict or uncertainty in the hospital. We're not like giving them answers or anything like that. Nonsense. I mean, this is just something that's just made me nuts since I started doing this work a number of years ago. Oh, there it is, okay. And here's some examples that I've pulled from you, pulled to show you. I'm not gonna go through all of these, but I was thinking last night, I was like, I think I've been yelled at for every one of these statements at some point in my career. I can think of a case where I said, we don't actually think there is a morally relevant distinction between withdrawing and withholding. Or actually, we want to give your dad some more morphine because, he's writhing in pain in his hospital bed, and we recognize that this might hasten his death, but thank you, Catholics, we have this notion of doctrine of double effect that we use even in the secular world to have this notion of terminal sedation. Whew. I mean, this is very morally contentful stuff that people disagree with very strongly in the hospital all the time, doctors and patients. So who am I speaking for? Who am I speaking from? What community or what basis am I speaking out of when I say these kinds of things in the hospital? It's kind of a lonely and a weird space to be a clinical ethicist in the world today, to be going around making these kinds of moral claims and, with all of these challenges, in the background, and it's a weird time to do this work. Oh my God, I have 4 minutes. Okay, so Englehart's positive project. So we can't have any moral content. The positive project reduces to what he calls the principle of permission. Principle of permission just says it is morally contentless. It just says you get all the stakeholders in a room, you see if they can agree to do something, and if they can agree, then you do it. And if they can't agree, then you just allow them to go their separate ways. There's no content to the principle of permission. This is really important because if it had content, it would immediately fall to the trilemma that he uses to reject, every other morally contentful view. And, this kind of has an initial allure to our Western autonomy-loving ears because we're like, oh yeah, that's autonomy, right? No, it's not. Here's an example of why this is so different from the standard approach. So Jehovah's Witness parents wanting to refuse a life-saving blood transfusion for their children. On the standard view, we say, you can't do that. We're going to provide the blood and save the child's life. On Englehart's view, you have to honor it and the child will die. Because what's happened is the people in the room have not been able to give their permission on what to do, so they should be allowed to turn and go their separate ways. And when the parents turn and go their separate ways, they get to take their children with them. Now, one of the problems with this view, as some of you might be detecting already, is that it already has built into it a view of property. Englehart's very libertarian. You own your children. A Lockean view of property. You own them because you've mixed your labor with them. It's very philosophical. This is a very damning problem for him because it's supposed to be morally contentless. 2 minutes, okay. So we go through a number of critiques in the book about why we want to reject this postmodern approach to secular bioethics. It's impossible. Because it already presumes, it fails its own standard of attempting to be morally contentless. It's immoral because it leads to a lot of moral implications that most of us would find to be just completely unacceptable, egregious ways to practice medicine, and it's extremely impractical. Sorry I can't say more about this. My remaining slides, I was actually going to go, let me just tell you about the deception thing real quick. I was actually going to go through and say, so Englehart says over and over again, oh, the principle of permission is consistent with the doctrine of informed consent. It is absolutely not. There's a lot of moral content embedded in the doctrine of informed consent that we use in the hospital. And this is not the best example of that, but because people will probably disagree with this, but one of the things that Englehart's principle of permission would absolutely reject is any form of deception in the hospital. But that's not what we say, actually, in secular bioethics. There are many situations where deception can be an ethically permissible option when the alternatives are terrible. The case that I had this week, this patient, very large, very strong, threatening our staff, hurting herself, eating screws, a piece of her phone, actually. And they were trying to hold her down and force these antipsychotics into her. And I said, she was drinking a lot of orange juice. And I recommended mixing it in her orange juice and giving it to her as an alternative. That's yeah, I'll set it up.
I think we have an emerging moral tradition about juices in bioethics. So our next speaker is Matthew Shea from Baylor. And thanks, Matthew. And I will also keep you on time.
All right. Thank you, John, and thank you all for coming today. So I'm going to pick up where Abe left off. Like Abe, I'm a philosopher by training, but I'm currently a professor in a medical school and do clinical ethics in a hospital, like Abe does. So he set the stage for our project. It falls on me to deliver the promissory note of having a positive vision to fill the void if you've knocked down the postmodern approach. Abe had a lot more devastating objections he didn't have time for. But after dispensing with it, we need something to say. We need something to offer to be able to justify giving moral guidance in this context. So he explained why we reject the postmodern approach, why we do think there is consensus on some substantive moral issues. But we are not just going to appeal to some free-floating consensus, right, detached from any philosophical commitments. We want to situate this within a larger moral framework. So what I'll do today is lay out the central thesis, the main idea behind our project, which is that bioethics should be understood as an emerging moral tradition. So to clarify, when I say bioethics, I mean what Abe meant, right? The contemporary mainstream secular form that we find operative out there today in medical ethics, public health ethics, research ethics, and in the US specifically. And by secular, this is a trigger word for a lot of people, I just mean non-religious, but not anti-religious. So it's not drawing on any kind of religious theological tradition. So we would call it, in a room of Catholics, right? I would call it natural law, like a thin version of natural law. That's even more triggering than secular to bioethicists, so we'd never use that term. But if you don't like secular, just substitute natural law, right? I think that's fair. Okay, so in developing our account of tradition, we draw on the work of Alistair McIntyre and Jeffrey Stout, primarily. Like Engelhardt, these two are critics of the Enlightenment project of trying to justify a contentful secular morality based on a certain view of rational justification that McIntyre calls Enlightenment rationality. And here, Enlightenment rationality appeals to universal, neutral, abstract, rational standards, moral first principles, that are supposed to be undeniable for any reasonable, morally serious person, and that adopts a view from nowhere that's independent of any kind of historical, social, cultural particularities. That's one option. Another one is the contentless proceduralism that we saw exemplified by thinkers like Engelhardt, that really abandons all hope of giving any justified moral guidance and settles for just a modus vivendi based on processes. And Abe just explained why we think there's good reasons to reject that approach. So we need a third way. And the third way that we're trying to develop is centered on the notion of a tradition. So drawing on McIntyre, McIntyre says this, which we take as one inspiration. He says, quote, "All reasoning takes place within the context of some traditional mode of thought," unquote. And while McIntyre and Stout have developed this idea of tradition, and we borrow that in formulating our view, they haven't applied it to bioethics specifically. But David Solomon, another hero of the De Nicola Center in this conference, did have this very intriguing suggestion that we came across. And he suggested that the problem of moral pluralism in bioethics could be more tractable if we do this. So Solomon said, if we, quote, "attempt to reconceive the nature of ethical inquiry in such a way that it simultaneously promises less and delivers more, which is provided in the recent proposal of Alistair McIntyre's that we adopt a picture of moral inquiry as tradition constituted. By abandoning the pretense of speaking authoritatively on matters of ethics and practical reason from outside any socially constituted tradition, ethical inquirers are able to more seriously engage their audience. By trying to speak from nowhere, they end up speaking to nobody. By learning to speak from somewhere, they might end up having something to say to everybody." So Solomon, too, never really developed that thought. I'd love to know what he had in mind there. We're trying to take his lead and kind of run with that. So tradition. So I had to make reference to Fiddler on the Roof here because this was the first and only musical I was ever in way back in high school. And every time I hear tradition, that's like the picture in my head is Tevye and the music. But contrary to my wife's recommendation, there is no chance I will be singing that. That would be my last appearance at any conference ever if I sang it. So you can play it in your head if you like that song too. This is a really key distinction for us. So we want to distinguish two different meanings of tradition. The first one is a narrower, stricter sense of tradition that requires members to agree on a worldview or what Rawls calls a comprehensive doctrine. And examples would be like the utilitarian tradition in moral philosophy, the Catholic tradition in theology. The second one is a broader, looser sense of tradition, which doesn't require a shared worldview or comprehensive doctrine and has more modest commitments. And so Stout, in his critique of MacIntyre, accuses him of equivocating between these two different senses of tradition, which leads him to, as Stout puts it, quote, both underestimate the level of agreement on the good actually exhibited by our society and overestimate the level required for us to reason coherently with each other on most matters of moral concern, unquote. So we agree with that criticism. And like Stout, we want to understand tradition in that broader, looser sense. So first, what I'll do in my talk is just to describe the key characteristics of the tradition as we see it, and then I will argue that bioethics has all of these features and therefore counts as a moral tradition. At the end, I'll highlight some of the major kind of philosophical features of our bigger framework. Okay, so what is a tradition as we're understanding it? So first, it's a form of inquiry, a historically extended conversation about the nature and content and standards of rationality and truth. In place of Enlightenment rationality, MacIntyre offers this rival tradition-based epistemology. And on his view, the substantive standards of rationality vary across traditions. So we're not adopting MacIntyre's entire epistemology. Both of us reject kind of the epistemic relativism built in there. But we do borrow this idea that different traditions have different conceptions of rational justification. They're not all identical. Second, traditions include modes of action or practices. MacIntyre defines a practice very famously as a socially established cooperative human activity with its own internal goods and standards of excellence. So for example, medicine is a practice. It's aimed at internal goods like health and the well-being of patients, not external goods like money or social status. And it involves standards of excellence for physicians like medical knowledge and trustworthiness. Third, traditions are historical. Every tradition has some beginning at a point in the past, with a particular historical, linguistic, social starting point, and they start from a given set of beliefs and practices rather than a blank slate, and we think that's really important to emphasize. So Stout puts it like this, quote, none of us starts from scratch in moral reasoning, nor can we start over again. We begin already immersed in the assumptions and precedents of a tradition, whether religious or secular, and we revise these assumptions and set new precedents as we learn more about ourselves and the world. So a tradition of thought doesn't discard the past, it learns from it, but it tries to develop it and improve upon it. Fourth, traditions have narratives, and narrative has the function of adding an evaluative dimension to a history. So it's a way of framing and interpreting events and taking some kind of evaluative perspective on them. We see the history of a tradition not as like a value-free sequence of happenings, but as a value-laden story of victory and defeat, progress and regress, conflict and resolution, heroes and villains. And that's why MacIntyre describes a tradition as a not yet completed narrative. Fifth, traditions are social. Most of our beliefs are formed and held and tested in conjunction with other people, and most practices are social activities that involve others. A tradition is composed of a particular community with a shared social nexus and way of life. It's not universal to all humankind, and it represents the collective thought of a people. Sixth, traditions have canonical texts. MacIntyre says that the thought of a tradition has to be embodied in a set of texts, and these are authorities. They're points of debate, of consensus, of reference, right, within a tradition. Sometimes they contain key points of belief or practice that, if rejected, would put you outside of the tradition. So think about somebody who claims to be part of the Christian tradition but utterly rejects the Bible as having any value or authority. That would be hard to remain in the tradition. And finally, conflict and disagreement play a vital role in the health of a tradition. It's in good order when its members are involved in ongoing debates and arguments with each other, with external critics, about these ends and goods that are constitutive of the tradition. And so existing traditions can mature, and new traditions can be born, and failed traditions can die in the crucible of disagreement. Rational argument is essential to their health. And so McIntyre says this: traditions, when vital, embody continuities of conflict. When one does not, it is always dying or dead. Okay, now that we've laid out very briefly kind of the key characteristics of a tradition, let's try to apply this lens to contemporary bioethics. And we're proposing that it's a moral tradition. So it's a tradition of moral inquiry with moral beliefs and practices, rather than a political tradition, say, or a religious tradition. Importantly, it's contentful from the very beginning. It starts from somewhere, right, with an initial set of philosophical commitments, not from nowhere with some kind of neutral blank slate. We think that bioethics has all the marks of the tradition that I just ran through. First, it has epistemological, moral, and metaphysical beliefs. They include methods of rational inquiry, discursive practices, criteria of rational justification. These are going to be epistemic standards that are a lot more modest than certainty, unanimity, conclusive arguments, which the Enlightenment Project and critics would say fail, right? We agree with that. We just don't think that that should be the bar for success. They also include very specific moral beliefs. For example, physicians have an obligation to promote their patients' health. Autonomous research subjects have a right to be informed about the studies that they're participating in. Second, it has moral practices. Some are very specific ways of acting, like the practice of obtaining informed consent before medical treatment, having parents act as the default decision makers for their children, for pediatric patients, keeping patient privacy by maintaining confidentiality in medical records. Others are general practices like having ethics committees and consultants at hospitals, IRBs, overseeing research studies. Third and fourth, it has a history and a narrative. So it's a new tradition. It originated sometime around the 1970s. Some inciting events would be the Nuremberg trials and the atrocities of Nazi physicians, the Tuskegee syphilis study, infamous abuses there, the development of new medical technologies like oral contraceptives and assisted reproductive technologies and hemodialysis and organ transplantation, famous court cases like Roe and Quinlan, Cruzan, legislation like the Uniform Determination of Death Act and the Baby Doe regulations, the founding of bioethics centers, the Hastings Center, the Kennedy Institute, the President's Commissions on Bioethics, President's Councils, many more things. The tradition has its own group of founding figures. That includes theologians like Paul Ramsey and Joseph Fletcher and Lisa Cahill, philosophers like Daniel Callahan and Robert Veitch and Baruch Brody, physicians like Andre Helligers, Edmund Pellegrino, Mark Siegler, others like the legal scholar Patricia King, the librarian Doris Goldstein, lots of others, right? These founding figures of bioethics. And there are narrative themes in the tradition. Some of the big ones would be the shift from physician paternalism to patient autonomy, the patient's rights and disability rights movements, the introduction of new technologies and grappling with what to do with them, the waning influence of religion in public life. Fifth, bioethics has its own moral community. In one sense, the tradition reflects the thought of professional bioethicists, but it really encompasses a broader population, including healthcare providers, researchers, lawyers, legislators, politicians, and ordinary citizens. And the moral framework that it has is a particular professional morality for the practice of medicine, understood as like Western evidence-based medicine. So, it primarily governs the practice of professionals, right, like doctors in a hospital, rather than patients or research subjects. And it's only meant to cover this practice. So it's not a universal general morality for all domains of life. It's a limited particular morality for evidence-based medicine as we understand that today. Finally, it has the canonical texts and the conflicts that we find in healthy traditions. Some of the texts Abe went over, right, these core references put forward by the American Society for Bioethics and Humanities, the leading kind of national bioethics organization, the Belmont Report, which started research ethics, the AMA and ANA and ACP codes of ethics, these professional codes of ethics we find out there, famous books like Al Johnson's The Birth of Bioethics and Beecham and Childress's Principles of Biomedical Ethics, the four-box method of Johnson, Siegler, and Winslade, and other core references. And it's marked by continuous disagreement. Everybody who's spent any time in bioethics knows that. You can always generate disagreement in whatever context. I'm sure we'll see that in a few minutes. There's ongoing debates with members themselves and with external critics about all sorts of issues: the proper methodology in bioethics, the role of ethicists, whether they have expertise, the goals of medicine, not to mention specific controversial issues, right, that we can all think of. At the same time, there's lots of constructive disagreements in the tradition that have been resolved. This gets overlooked a lot, right? We focus on the things where we disagree, right, the hot button issues. We overlook a lot of the agreement that we've had. And Abe mentioned a whole slew of them. One might be that there's no intrinsic moral difference between withholding and withdrawing treatment, the equivalence thesis, right? You won't find many people disagreeing with that. Sometimes, yes, but most people, there's some consensus about that. So here, did I miss the other? There we go. That's later. This was one of my students here. I have to give credit for making this meme. They meant it as a knock on philosophers, which is fair. I think it applies to bioethicists too, how much we like to disagree. So the tradition, it's important to emphasize it's emerging, right? So this is a key feature. It's in its early stages. It's only like 50 years old. It's not a mature tradition like the Aristotelian tradition, the Catholic tradition that's been around for a long time and is more fully developed. It's extremely young. It's a new and distinct tradition, so we don't think it's an outgrowth of an existing philosophical or religious tradition. It's not some version of liberalism. It's not a version of Christianity. It has relationships to them, for sure, but it's its own independent tradition at this point. And it's drawn from lots of different ones. It draws on other existing traditions to develop its own cohesive system. So it's emergent historically. It's also emergent metaphysically, where it draws on a lot of pieces from other schools of philosophical religious thought, but it's greater than the sum of its parts. Okay, so for the rest of my talk, what I want to do is kind of give a big picture overview of some of the key features of the tradition as we see it, of our bigger account. We're trying to do a descriptive and a normative project. So we're trying to both describe the tradition as it exists right now, but also give a normative philosophical defense of it, right? So it's not supposed to be purely descriptive. There are a few things about methodology that we think are important. The first one is that it uses secular reason as its mode of discourse and rational justification. The content of the tradition doesn't come from a particular religious belief system. It can borrow things from them, but it's not appealing directly to religion for its content. The beliefs that it has are not based on faith or divine revelation or religious authority. Instead, they're based on reason, common human experience, consensus. For those in the Catholic tradition, this is the part where you can say it's really just kind of natural law, light bioethics, where we understand natural law in this more minimal sense as objective moral truths that are discovered through reason, but not necessarily with all of the metaphysical moral theory trappings, right? Philosophical anthropology. Another method is moral bricolage. Abe and our other co-author, Jason Iberl, have done some work on this and defended this idea. Here we take stock of the ethical questions that we need to answer. We look at the available conceptual resources that we have from a variety of traditions, and then we try to meld those, pull apart, take them, put them together, right, to kind of come up with a solution. And the third tool, and maybe the most important one, is a mid-level approach. So for those who are familiar with Beecham and Childress and principlism, this will be their approach too, although we're going to do it differently. So we can think about 3 levels of content in ethics: specific and concrete judgments about individual cases. For example, it's wrong to lie to Mrs. Brown about her cancer diagnosis. The second level is more general and abstract norms. For example, there's a prima facie duty not to lie to people. And the third level, even more general and abstract, theoretical doctrines, such as morality is fundamentally about respecting the dignity of persons as ends, right, as a Kantian would say. High-level theories, deontology, utilitarianism, natural law theory in that sense, are generalists. They prioritize this third level of theoretical doctrine. They're comprehensive accounts of ethics. Low-level anti-theories like casuistry or narrative ethics or moral particularism prioritize that first level of moral judgments. Mid-level theories are at that middle level, and they center on the more general moral norms, like principles, rules, obligations, rights, virtues, that justify and explain particular judgments. So they don't ground them in more foundational moral theories, unlike the high-level approach. And this is the main approach that the tradition of bioethics has adopted, and it's the one that we adopt in this book. I'll skip that second to last slide. Here's a quick sketch of the moral framework. So at the level of theory, we want to construct a theory of bioethics. It's going to have mid-level ethical, epistemological, and metaphysical content, so it speaks to all three. But it doesn't have any kind of comprehensive general theory of epistemology, ethics, or metaphysics. At the practical level, we have a code of bioethics where you have to take the general norms and you have to specify them more, add content, weigh them, balance them against each other so that it's action guiding enough. And we also show how to apply this code to particular cases so that you can have specific verdicts and recommend concrete ways of acting in the context of, say, an ethics consultation in a hospital. And so I don't have time to get into the details. I wanted to put this slide so people could see the overall picture, right? And it's a lot of work. It's very ambitious. That's why there's three of us. But ultimately what we want to show is that if we conceive of secular bioethics as a contentful moral tradition, then we're going to get both a better descriptive account of what it is and also a better normative account of how it can give justified normative guidance in a pluralistic society like ours. So that's the goal. This is how we plan to get there. We're excited to see your feedback and thoughts and objections on that. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Matt. Our final speaker is Sister Caroline Marito, and she's going to further talk about the convergences and divergences. And I'd just like to say, Alistair McIntyre has been sort of bouncing around in my head for 30 years, but Tom Beecham also died this year, and this is probably the only session where anybody who would care about Tom Beecham would be right now. And so I just thought I would note that because whether you'll like his work or not, he's a huge conversation partner for all the stuff we're talking about. So, Sister.
All right, my name is Sister Caroline Marie. I'm a religious sister of mercy, and our mother house is in Alma, Michigan. I'm actually working on a doctorate in bioethics. So what I'm presenting today in my paper is a tiny fraction of my doctoral work. So I apologize in advance because I'm going to go through a lot of things very quickly and presume a lot of things for the sake of time. And so this paper is entitled Anthropological Convergences, Bridging Thomistic Moral Theology and Secular Bioethics. So trying to bring in a particular moral tradition into secular bioethics. So Tom Beauchamp and James Childress's Principles of Biomedical Ethics, or PBE, has been widely espoused as the way to do bioethics in the United States for over 50 years. It is most well known for its 4 principles of respect for autonomy, non-maleficence, beneficence, and justice. PBE is a flexible framework that was designed to serve a pluralistic society, accommodating diverse views of the human person and differing ethical beliefs. Indeed, many Catholics have used it as a tool to resolve bioethical issues. The question taken up in this paper is whether PBE is compatible with a Catholic anthropology, a crucial question since anthropology colors approaches to medicine and bioethical issues. As Romano Cesario succinctly put it, quote, mistakes about the human being prompt mistakes in ethics, end quote. If using Beauchamp and Childress's framework requires starting from an anthropology that misrepresents reality, then it is reasonable to doubt the validity of its conclusions. In this paper, I will first make explicit the unspoken anthropology of PBE. Then I will compare this anthropology with Catholic anthropology, noting points of convergence and divergence. Finally, I will argue that the anthropological view of PBE can be reconciled with Catholic anthropology. Now, in the interest of time, I will presume a general understanding of Catholic anthropology as being the one set forth by Thomas Aquinas and incorporated into magisterial teaching. And I will also presume a general familiarity with PBE's structure. So if we look first at the unspoken anthropology of PBE, no explicit anthropology is stated in the text in an effort to avoid debates about which foundational ethical system is correct. Despite its attempts to remain agnostic about an anthropological view, I will demonstrate that there is actually an implicit view of the human person being put forward. The 3 aspects I will highlight in this paper are, first, the human intellect and will, second, the relationship of the body and the soul, and third, the centrality of the individual patient. So turning first to the human intellect and will. One aspect of this implicit anthropology of PBE is that the man has intellect and will. This is most clearly seen in their discussions regarding the capacity for autonomous choice and the topic of competency, a precursor for informed consent. The standard of capacity deals with mental faculties that an autonomous person has. It involves understanding relevant information, reasoning rationally, and communicating the decisions and the rationale for it. This emphasis on knowledge and choice is subjective. So long as the person can explain why his choice reasonably achieves the goal he has determined, it is justified. And this goal is determined solely by the person. Discussions on quality of life and physician-assisted suicide consider aspects of prolonged pain and suffering, loss of functional capacity, and so forth, implying that the end of human life perhaps is something along the lines of experiencing pleasure, being without pain, or the capacity to do certain things. Unsurprisingly, notably absent from the text is any concern about a specific teleology of the human person. Beauchamp and Childress state that humans are capable of, quote, self-reflection about whether one's acts are obligatory or prohibited, right or wrong, good or bad, virtuous or vicious, end quote. This moral judgment can either judge prospectively, concurrently with the action, or retrospectively. This capacity is presupposed by the field of medical ethics. PBE further recognizes the role of virtue in shaping human decisions. For them, virtue is a dispositional trait that is valuable, reliably present, and is related to a person's character. A human person is capable of more than merely fulfilling obligations. There can be a praiseworthiness attached to supererogatory actions. Thus, the human person can develop virtue, which aids in praiseworthy human actions, and there is a capacity in the human person for acting heroically. Second, the role of the human body and the human soul. Now, little is said about either of these in the text. However, it seems that Beauchamp and Childress view the core of the human person to be in the intellect and will as being the power to choose. The body is merely something to be manipulated or subjected to medical interventions. The relation of the person to the body is one of ownership, and the body is possessed like any other type of property. Thus, one can do what one wants with it, up to and including disposing of it entirely. Such possession is absolute. In their treatment of paternalism, for example, they take the view that the most paternalistic actions are not justifiable. Even though a physician has professional expertise in matters of medicine, their expertise is simply one factor for consideration as to why paternalistic action is justified. Additionally, PBE makes no mention of a human soul. Now, this is not surprising given their goal of an ethical system that's not grounded on any moral system, and certainly not based on any philosophical or theological view. And it is unclear where they would locate the power to reason or choose. Finally, the triumph of the individual patient. There is an emphasis in PBE on the individual as the locus of moral consideration and moral action. Indeed, the patient is most strongly associated with the exercise of his or her will by means of choosing his or her medical care. Very little attention is paid to the patient being part of a network of social relations. For example, when considering what standard a surrogate decision maker should use, they take the position that the determinative factor should be the best interest of the patient, even if this conflicts with familial interests. Sacrificing for the good of others, particularly for close relations, is not part of the consideration. This emphasis on individualism can also be seen in how they address the relationship between physician and patient. The bulk of their discussion involving the physician-patient relationship treats it in a legalistic sense. Borrowing language from the American tort liability system, Beauchamp and Childress focus on duty, breach, harm, and causality. The physician in their analysis is effectively merely an agent of the patient. For example, in discussing the foregoing of life-sustaining treatment, they hold that it is the validity of the authorization by the patient that morally justifies withdrawing or withholding medical treatment. They discount the physician's moral assessment of it as an independent agent of action. The physician-patient relationship is one in which the physician is merely the agent on behalf of the patient, and is not a relationship of mutual collaboration with respect to the health of the patient. For Beauchamp and Childress, moral culpability rests solely upon whether the patient has given valid consent. Thus, the primary focus of social relations, at least as regards the medical theater, is transactional or contractual, rather than as a communion of persons. Thus, Beauchamp and Childress do not explicitly lay out their theory of anthropology, and it seems for them the identity of the person is primarily located in the intellect and the will. What constitutes the flourishing of a person appears to be the exercise of choice. Proper exercise of choice requires having the information necessary to make an informed decision voluntarily. This decision creates a duty in others to respect that decision and possibly to act in accord with that decision. The relation of the intellect and will to the body is as one possessing property. Now, from the foregoing, there are clear points of convergence with Catholic anthropology and the anthropology of PBE, as well as aspects in which they differ significantly. Let us first consider the similarities. One clear point of clear agreement is the existence of two different powers, the intellect and the will. Generally, the human person is one who can appreciate and understand information. The information can be utilized in such a way that the person can assess the situation and make decisions based upon it. The human person can choose to act or not to act. As such, a human person can choose to do what is good or choose not to do it. There is also similarity in the general understanding of the human capacity for virtue, and this is something desirable and praiseworthy. Both anthropologies see some relation between past actions and the character of a person, though the specifics of how this arises and how these are found in the human person are not fully developed in PBE. Further, there is an agreement in both anthropologies that there are morally praiseworthy, extraordinary actions that go beyond moral obligations. These actions are not required to be performed, but when they are, there is a moral goodness found in them and in the actor. Nevertheless, there are substantial differences. The most significant point of divergence is that of the immaterial soul. As I mentioned, no acknowledgement is made of the soul in PBE, yet the existence of an immaterial soul is of utmost importance in Catholic anthropology. It is in the soul that we find the rational powers of the intellect and the will. Beauchamp and Childress offer no speculation on where the powers to reason and choose lie. However, I think it is unlikely that they conceive of an immaterial soul as Thomas Aquinas does, that is, as the animating force of the body and the powers proper to it. It is not surprising, therefore, that there is a divergence in conceptualizing the aim of human existence. Beauchamp and Childress espouse at best an agnostic view as to whether there is a particular purpose to human existence, and this lack of teleology is embedded within PBE. By contrast, Catholic anthropology understands the central importance of an ultimate end for the human person being contained within the very nature of the person. Indeed, the very goal of life, which is eternal happiness, is understood to be intimately tied to moral conduct. Now, to reach this happiness requires God's grace. If human actions are always aimed at some end, it matters what that end is, and whether one understands our various ends tend to some final ultimate end. Indeed, as John J. Fitzgerald has observed, PBE entirely misses the fundamental and causal relations between ethical actions and one's own happiness. Relatedly, there are different conceptions of freedom found in Catholic anthropology and in PBE. A Catholic notion of freedom is a freedom for excellence. Freedom is not simply a matter of the ability to choose, but of being able to choose well. Beauchamp and Childress view freedom as a form of non-control. Their view is one of a freedom of indifference in that the focus is merely on the ability to choose between different options, regardless of whether they are morally good or bad. Beauchamp and Childress do opine that one can still be fully autonomous in following religious authority, however. Though these conceptions of freedom differ, both views recognize freedom as a significant, albeit non-absolute good, and that the exercise of one's freedom should generally be respected. In summary, then, points of convergence between the Catholic anthropology and the anthropology of PBE are the existence of a material body, the powers of intellect and will, and the capacity for virtue and moral judgment. The two differ in first, whether there is an immaterial soul, second, whether there is a specific telos, and third, the understanding of freedom. With this background, we are now primed to turn to the question of whether Catholic anthropology can be received into PBE. It is clear that PBE does not always reflect Catholic anthropology. While one might be tempted to take the position that this difference makes the two incompatible, I propose that PBE does allow for a utilization of a Catholic anthropology. Though PBE lacks a conception of the immortal soul or of a natural human teleology, the system itself does not exclude such considerations. The explicit anthropology of PBE is not counter to the possibility of an immortal soul, and with it, a particular end of the human person. The rational capacities of the person, which are so highly regarded and integral to the PBE framework, are preserved with the Catholic anthropology, for the ability to reason and make decisions is also found in a Catholic anthropology. Arguably, a Catholic anthropology enhances and clarifies what these powers are and how they function. For example, integral to Beauchamp and Childress's conception of biomedical ethics is that individuals should be given information about their medical condition and normally be allowed to determine whether they desire to have a particular procedure or treatment. They do not explain the internal dynamism that allows for this understanding and decision-making to occur. Rather, they identify the experiential sensibility as well as the observable external actions that are valued in medical situations. Catholic anthropology, on the other hand, provides a way to speak of how the intellect and will work together in carrying out a human act. Virtue theory also explains how habits inhere in the various powers of the human person and assist the person in performing good moral actions. Moreover, PBE lacks an explanation for why it matters that human persons should use their reason to understand, judge, and act, and that it matters for the principle of respect for autonomy to turn upon it. Why is it not just as equally valid for a strong sense of paternalism to be enforced, where the healthcare provider simply does what he determines to be best for the patient? PBE lacks any strong answer to this. Catholic anthropology does explain why there ought to be a presumption that individuals should be allowed to decide for themselves what medical treatments to accept or refuse, and why a healthcare provider should normally respect this decision. In this way, a rationale for principles picked out by PBE is available through a deeper anthropology. The usefulness of Catholic anthropology and PBE can be illustrated by way of an analogy. Consider a growing tree. There are many ways of describing how a tree grows. A 10-year-old may be able to explain to you that trees require sunlight, water, and soil to grow. An arborist could describe the growth of the branch tips and how the cambium layer forms the rings of the trunk. A biochemist could explain the Calvin cycle and how that sustains the tree. Each of these accounts is true, and it adds something to the understanding of how a tree grows. However, the arborist and biochemist explanations offer greater clarity and depth because of their more profound understanding. Now, in a similar way, the implied anthropology of PBE does tell us something true about the human person, much like the child's explanation of how a tree grows. It is true, for example, that human beings generally have the capacity to know things and to act volitionally. Yet this explanation of the human person presented lacks a fullness to it, a fullness that Catholic anthropology can supply through its explanation of the intellect as a rational apprehension and the will as a rational appetition. A Catholic anthropology can tease out how the intellect and the will interact in a human act to appreciate better how these powers work in tandem. Moreover, Catholic anthropology allows us to understand human action and how such actions are motivated by the final end. Even more so, the Church has taught that only in light of Jesus Christ can the truth of the human person be fully known. Thus, PBE's anthropology limps in that it cannot fully explain the human person simply because it lacks the insight to do so. Catholic anthropology, therefore, fills out the anthropology presented in PBE, providing a fuller and richer understanding of the human person. It goes deeper than the anthropology presented in PBE by identifying where the capacities for reasoning and willing can be found and how these bespeak a teleology proper and inherent to the human person. Through this, it also provides tools for explaining why the human individual person does matter. It places the individual person within a community of other persons, relationships by which one becomes fully human. Moreover, it gives insight into what is good for a human person through greater insight into the essence of the human being. So in conclusion, PBE has an implicit anthropology that is not wholly consistent with Catholic anthropology. While there are substantial differences, the framework of PBE is open to a Catholic anthropology. PBE's anthropology could be considered as a broad brush sketch of the human person. The details of this sketch can be filled in through a Catholic anthropology. And a more complete understanding of the person makes PBE a much more powerful tool for analyzing bioethical questions. Thank you.
So we have a circulating microphone expert over here. So if you have questions, please raise your hand and direct them at one or all of our speakers. Yeah, I have plenty if you don't.
Hi, Allie Burden. My question is mostly for Abram and Matthew. I'm wondering how you would conceive of who governs the tradition of secular bioethics as far as like who decides like what counts as being in, what counts as being out, especially since you say that this is supposed to apply to basically everyone working in healthcare in like, you know, America essentially. You know, how do you, and especially like, how do you make that claim that secular bioethics should have moral authority over all of them and they should all buy into that? Thank you.
Yeah, good question. So this was part of it was with the kind of mid-level thing I was talking about, but we are understanding this, if it works, right? If it works, then it's supposed to be kind of a common core of content. Both ethical is going to be the most important one, but also we think epistemological and even metaphysical, anthropological. It won't be full Catholic anthropology, but something, right? That everybody can. This is where the idea of consensus, not as like universal agreement, we're never going to get that, but acceptable to all reasonable persons, right? At least in principle. So that's why we appeal to things like public reason. We won't call it natural law, but here let's call it natural law, right? To reason that at least most human beings who are going to be involved either on the clinician side or the researcher side or the patient side or families or whatever can find acceptable, right? You're not just appealing to some comprehensive philosophical moral theory, some religious belief system. So who decides who's in it? I guess the whole community kind of collectively comes to agree on this kind of mid-level content, right? And that there's going to be a lot of overlap, we think, between people who are coming at it from very different philosophical, religious, moral perspectives. They can share some of these commitments that we're identifying at that mid-level, right? This kind of common core. In terms of saying who's in and who's out, we are very averse to policing the boundaries of the tradition. So anybody who's committed to things like public reason and these basic principles, maybe like seeing patients as persons as opposed to like collections of organ systems, like some material package of organs, that stuff is going to be in. People like Engelhardt, who are just going to say the whole thing is hopeless and it's just the principle of permission, right? Whatever you agree to and there's no content that can be justified, they're out of it, right? I mean, at least intellectually, their theory is not compatible with it. The same would go for a hardcore utilitarian who's going to say we need the entire package of utilitarian theory, right, to bring to bear, because that's going to be too committal, too loaded, right, too comprehensive. But most people don't come at it like that, right? Most people aren't on either of those extremes. And at least we found in the practical context of doing medical ethics, which is kind of where we live a lot of the time, people have very different views, but everybody kind of recognizes that there are these common shared philosophical commitments. And so anybody who is on board with that, right, and is in the same community doing the same activities would be in, and everybody who rejects kind of essential stuff like public reason is going to be out.
Just to, because it's such a fundamental question, I think I'll stick here for a second. So we actually opened the book by thinking about the pandemic as like a primary example of what we take to be the work of the tradition. So at the outbreak of the pandemic, there was all this panic about, oh my gosh, we're running out of ventilators. How are we going to decide who lives and who dies, right? And we panicked in healthcare. And it was what we would call the tradition that generated, drawing on deliberation, discourse that we've been developing for decades, allocation criteria for ventilators in the pandemic. And there were iterations of it as the tradition continued. We had one, it's like, maybe we're doing a little bit too much with prognosis here, disability ethics theorists coming in, tweaking it a little bit. It was this really robust discourse that had a huge impact on how we allocated ventilators more or less the same way in hospitals all across the US. And I think that when you initially hear this idea, it sounds kind of ludicrous in the society that we're currently in, where we seem to have all these intractable disagreements. But a lot of what we do in the book is show that there's actually a lot of stuff, those 22 books that references that I pointed out, that we have really important agreements about. But to this point about core beliefs, because I really like to think about Catholics, actually, when I do this work. I've actually argued that the secular world needs an ethical and religious directives document to mirror the Catholic. I actually just made one on ChatGPT the other week. And we would need something like our bishops, it's going to be much, it's going to look different, but something like that to deliberate and tweak and modify our SEDs or whatever. But one of the core beliefs of that puts you within the tradition firmly or outside of it was at the very origin of bioethics. And it's this absolute rejection of any reductionistic account of the human person that so many people gathered, initially many theological voices, to start to resist in medicine throughout the middle and latter half of the 20th century. And I think that that's almost akin to like the resurrection for a Christian in terms of being like a core commitment of a member of this tradition. If you don't believe in it, it's a negative view, right? Like rejecting this reductionist account of the human person, you're not in the club.
They told me that if you give them a drink voucher tonight, they'll talk about polarization.
Thank you. My question is for Matthew. You mentioned relativism, and you were talking about McIntyre, kind of hinting that his position is relative. And I'm wondering how you yourself avoid relativism when it comes to the distinction between the secular bioethics tradition and the Catholic bioethics tradition, how you decide or adjudicate between those two traditions without falling into relativism yourself. Secondly, I have another question too. To refer to natural law, for Aquinas, divine law was needed to be added to it. So you're referring to this as a new tradition, the secular tradition from the 60s or 70s, but that makes it seem to be almost from nowhere, from scratch, rather than as a departure or deviation from the Catholic tradition of bioethics. But if we recognize that it's a departure, this raises the question of dependence. Is this truly a secular bioethics tradition? Is it truly secular if it is using assumptions it could not have attained without Catholic revelation or divine revelation? And therefore, why not think that this secular tradition will diverge further from the Catholic bioethics tradition as it purges from itself those implicit dependencies and importations from the Catholic bioethics tradition?
Thank you for those softball questions. I should have known in this audience that I had to be more careful with the relativism. I saw that you perked up at that, so that's good. I knew it was coming. So yeah, just to be fair to McIntyre, so he's not a relativist about truth, right? But I think he is a relativist about epistemic justification and rationality. So he's going to say there are some universal rational standards, but they're basically very limited to like the laws of logic, right? And all the substantive stuff that really makes a difference is tradition relative. So we reject that for like philosophical reasons and epistemology. How do we avoid relativism? Well, we don't, if we were doing the full philosophical defense, we would give arguments for moral objectivity, right, as part of the project. We are starting with that. That's one of the kind of ground level assumptions that we're making, because that's a little beyond what we can do. We're taking it for granted that there are some objective truths in ethics and that it's not just all relative, like moral truth is dependent on individual opinion or cultural convention, things like that. So we don't, that's how we avoid it. We just kind of stipulate that there are objective truths and that bioethics is ultimately grounded in moral truths as opposed to being just purely conventional, things like that, which is how some bioethicists talk. even if they don't really believe it. But I take it, the more interesting point, and I've certainly thought about this a lot as a Catholic, right, is since I am a member of two different traditions, right, the Catholic moral tradition, which has bioethical commitments, and then what we're calling secular bioethics as a tradition, and I live in both worlds. How do I square that, right? So it's a big question. I won't be able to do it justice. There's a lot of dimensions to it, but here's what I want to say. The fundamental, essential philosophical commitments as we see them are all things that are compatible with lots of different bigger traditions, comprehensive traditions, philosophical and religious, I would say including Catholicism, right? That's where you can see it as this is the natural law stuff. By this, I just mean like basic epistemological commitments that like reason is capable of knowing truths, right? Reason can discover some truths about ethics. That there are, the four principles that Sister mentioned are valid, right? Those are like genuine, true moral principles. We would say the same about certain virtues and goods. Some metaphysical commitments that Abe mentioned, right, about the person, about death, things like that. Those are very open-ended. They can be developed in different ways. So for me, the hard question would be, because this is just that mid-level kind of minimal set, it's certainly not a view of everything in ethics, epistemology, and metaphysics. It's possible in principle for this tradition of secular bioethics to develop in such a way that it would take certain positions on specific issues, say like euthanasia, assisted suicide, that would be flat out inconsistent with the Catholic tradition, right? It's possible that it could do that, right? Nothing that we're saying, nothing that's intrinsic to the philosophical content would rule that out. What would I do at that point? I would have to choose which tradition to belong to, so I would then leave the tradition of secular bioethics, right? I would have to, because that would be like a contradiction in a substantive, important sort of way. We don't see that it's gotten that way yet, right? A lot of the controversial issues where I think there's conflict, like actual fundamental conflict between the Catholic tradition and the secular bioethics tradition, are not things that we're saying are like essential parts of it, right? This is still areas of open debate and disagreement, and they're unsettled. So we definitely don't think that the tradition has a commitment on like the morality of euthanasia, on the real controversial things. That's why I'm okay living in both right now. But when push comes to shove, it's not impossible for there to be a conflict. And then you'd have to choose which one. So.
Sorry. Like 30 seconds, then we're going to do it. So one thing that I maybe we haven't made super clear that there might be more follow-up questions on, the Catholics are in the tradition that we're describing. We don't call it Catholic in the book. We call it the pathocentric view of the goals of medicine, in the way that Chris Tollefson and Farr and Hirshenov and a lot of these guys have developed. That's what gets them in the club. It's a public reasoned defense of a lot of these things that sit across the deepest divide. So it's not like there's my hospital and then, like the Catholics and we're like at war with each other. We're actually in this, we think of it as like Christianity and there's a Protestant and a Catholic division. It's at that kind of a fault line within the tradition of bioethics that we're describing. And it sorry, go.
So I'm going to step in with moderator's privilege and see if there are particular questions, particularly focused for Sister Caroline Marie. And I'm going to note that if you would like to linger and talk to our speakers after, this will be the last question, and linger after, please do. So, questions for Sister.
Sister, thanks for your presentation. It was actually Dr. Brumma's presentation got me to think about this, but your presentation really helped clarify in my mind. I'm just wondering if pedagogically, if we should be teaching, for example, future nurses to start with, here are the legal issues, and a lot of pre-professional ethics, I'm not even saying this is a good thing, but is about compliance. We're teaching you what the laws are. You don't want to get sued. But there's a concern that they then are being also taught, just leave it to the experts. You should just follow the law. And that's problematic. That if we start with the law, here are the 4 principles that you need to understand will be used publicly, and then we move on from there to the ethical issues that allow us to think about whether or not we ought to agree with those laws. And if we do, what is the freedom within the law to argue for and against various moral principles, and that does kind of help them understand that the thing we consent about publicly are the laws and procedures, but those also give us considerable freedom to disagree about certain issues that you might be asked to do this by a doctor or by somebody in the community, and if you don't have your own ethical principles you're thinking about, you're just setting yourself up for, for a kind of default accepting of their morality. So I was just kind of hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, but I think you point out a very important challenge in like our medical education right now, nursing education, other healthcare professions, in that there is this sense of like, here are the laws, don't get sued, leave the ethical questions to ethicists. In a community, our religious community has a number of sisters who are doctors, nurses, and such. Just recognizing that each healthcare professional actually has an obligation themselves to act morally is a very important thing, and that's not emphasized, I think, in most medical nursing programs right now. I think that these programs could really benefit by offering some coursework background in anthropology. Who is this human person that you're trying to work with in a medical context? Are you able to see that as a true human person and not just someone who's the subject of your medical intervention, someone whose arm is not well and so I'm going to treat their arm, but to see the person as a whole. And I think having that education that first and then moving on to the 4 principles or however one would want to teach ethics and the legal ramifications then makes more sense. Because really, if you don't have that core foundation of who is a human person, what am I doing to them, you can't tease out anything else. And that's part of what I'm hoping to do with my research is to point out that need.
Join me in thanking our speakers.